Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My guest today is Ben Barry, longstanding Intellect author and Dean of the School of Fashion at Parsons in New York. Ben, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you and great to have you on. How's things going?
Things are good. It's a beautiful sunny day in New York City. We're in week 3 of the semester, so campus is busy. And yeah, this is a good day, and this is one of my favorite times of year.
Oh, awesome. It's also a lovely sunny day down here in Tucson. So I'm really glad to have you on the podcast, and I'm going to jump right in with a few questions, I think, about your role at Parsons. Now, I know your appointment as Dean is fairly recent, but it seems that you have already made quite the impact. And I know that you're trying to really affect quite a lot of change. I realize that you're a team player as well, and that there's many people involved in some of the things that you're trying to achieve. Not only at Parsons, but also an international group of colleagues that you're working with too. But can you just tell us a little bit more about some of your goals and aspirations and some of your objectives now that you're the Dean of the School of Fashion at Parsons, and maybe tell us what Parsons is doing as an institution by supporting a scholar such as yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined Parsons in July 2021, so about 2.5 years ago. And I was previously chair of the fashion school at Toronto Metropolitan University, which was called Ryerson previously. And when I joined Parsons, it was really with a vision to collaborate with the community to center equity, inclusion, and decolonization in the culture and curriculum. And that's really the work that I did with my colleagues in Toronto and work that I wanted to do here. And I think Parsons was really interesting because there was always work around social and climate justice happening. It has always been part of the curriculum, but often it was happening by a few colleagues in a few classrooms and a few spaces. It wasn't an institutionalized effort in the School of Fashion. And so part of my role and my mission was to come in and think about how can we institutionalize equity and inclusion within the culture and curriculum. So it didn't depend on who was dean or who a student had as a professor and their own interest and passion, but it was part of the lifeblood of the school. And so in that first year, we did a really exciting visioning work where I worked with faculty and staff and students and alumni to think about what does Parsons mean to them? What do they see as the future of Parsons fashion? And through those conversations and really extensive survey work, we developed a new vision and guiding principles for the school, which was really about making social and climate justice the standard of fashion education and the standard of what we deliver at Parsons. And so since then, we've done some really exciting work. We've done a bunch of new faculty searches, cluster searches in fashion design and fashion management and social justice, bringing in just incredible experience from faculty who focus on fashion, on disability and textiles, on Indigenous fashion design and textiles, and really just complementing our existing faculty. We have just launched a cluster search in Indigenous art and design across Parsons with 2 positions in the School of Fashion where I'm dean. And that's something I had really helped kind of plant the seeds for when I began. And I'm excited that I've worked with my fellow deans to execute this now. So really intensive faculty hiring to bring in diverse lived experiences and knowledges that can then help us expand the curriculum. And that's exactly what we've done. We now have courses working, running on size diversity, on multisensory design, on fashion and disability, on Indigenous fashion, really just expanding what we can offer to students. And of course, part of that has also been how do we ensure that we have access for students who traditionally haven't had access to fashion education. And so in December, I launched with Sinead Burke the Parsons Disabled Fashion Student Program, which is a scholarship and mentorship program for disabled students with the first cohort beginning in fall 2024. And so we're really excited about that. So we're really trying to think about how then do we ensure that this really is a place where equity inclusion thrives, and that it's something we can cultivate. And recognizing it's slow, ongoing work, it doesn't happen overnight, but how can we put these programs and these faculty and these courses in place so it's embedded in who we are as a school of fashion?
I can't believe you've already been there 2.5 years. Time flies, right, when you're dealing with pandemics, I guess. Well, no, well, first of all, congratulations on what you have achieved so far. And I've been keeping an eye on things that are posted in the media and on social media and through Parsons. And from what I can see, you and your colleagues are affecting some real change and pushing the agenda. But your dean role only lasts a certain amount of time, I imagine. And I was just wondering, what are your kind of long-term goals, and are you finding that you're encountering quite a lot of challenges, or are you finding that you're able to tick these goals and move and progress things quite rapidly?
I think I'm really fortunate that I came into a community that deeply desired this change and this culture. So from the moment I arrived, there was no resistance. All of my colleagues were on board. Many of them had done work in this already. And so there was genuine support and interest and excitement to make this happen. And I think that that is rare. In many institutions, and particularly in fashion education that has a particular culture. And so I think having that support from the beginning allowed so much work to happen and happen quite quickly. I think right now I'm really committed just to continuing to build on what we're doing. There's still a lot to do, but to ensure that these programs we've developed, the new faculty we're hiring, the new courses, really become embedded in the culture, and that folks feel supported as they move about their journey here. And so a lot of it is the implementation of so many of the ideas, but ensuring that we follow that implementation in a way that's equitable, that supports people, and that really cares for them. Because that's ultimately how we can change culture.
Do you think it's quite important that you've come from Canada as well? Because I know that the Canadian institutions have been more progressive perhaps in some of their approach to hiring policies and things like that. And I know that there's some really key figures out there, like I guess Dean Dorey, or former Dean Dorey at Dorey Tunstall at OCAD, for example, who I know has been instrumental in driving hiring policy to be more equitable, for example, and to be more revolutionary, almost, you could say. And I know now in hindsight, some of those changes seem almost like normalized and like, how has this not happened previously? But I feel like that is something that I first encountered perhaps in Canada, and then now that through positions like yours, that's really becoming systemic change in the United States as well. Is that fair to say that Canada's perhaps leading the charge, or that we're seeing, I guess, more of these policies be adopted in the United States?
I mean, I'm biased because I'm Canadian, but I think my learning about how to implement this type of institutional change, what does it look like? What are the questions and considerations that need to be at the forefront, absolutely came from my time in Toronto, and certainly have been very much inspired, and full credit to Dorey Tunstall. She was dean at OCAD at the same time that I was chair of the fashion department at Toronto Metropolitan University. And obviously I had a chance to get to know her then, and also just observe and follow the work she was doing, and even take a course that she taught on how do you hire for equity, diversity, and decolonization, in a way that so much of the work she did informed how I was thinking about leadership and fashion education. And that played an instrumental role. And I think Canada certainly has really started to confront, in, I think, deep ways, its history of colonization and its violence towards Indigenous people, and is working on how do we start to redress that, coming from the government. And that has really influenced with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, right, that had a series of recommendations, including many for higher education, that really propelled slow shifts in curriculum, shifts in faculty hiring, shifts in student support, and And I think here at Parsons, one of the initiatives I've been working since I first got here was, what does it mean to study fashion at Parsons, on Lenape territory, which is New York City, on Turtle Island? If we have students, we have 50% of students are international. So they're coming here to study fashion. And what does that mean? And I think first and foremost, for me, that means recognizing the original makers, artists, designers, and the continued ongoing work that Indigenous fashion designers and artists do. And so ensuring that we had an Indigenous cluster hired to have a critical mass of at least 6 Indigenous faculty, that we could incorporate this knowledge into the curriculum, was an important step to say, this is what it means to study fashion at Parsons. And this is what it means, so students can learn and understand the history, understand the epistemologies and practices of Indigenous designers, and the ongoing work and the continued work today of Indigenous designers, that was centered. That was the first step to start to redress history, to think about decolonization, and also to really ground place-based knowledge of what it means to study fashion at Parsons. So I think that's a lot. I certainly learned that in Canada. This was an active conversation when I was chair. And obviously I also credit Dean Dory a lot, just with the work she's done and how much that has, I think, influenced me. And earlier this year, or in the fall, we brought Dory Tunstall here to meet with our Dean's Council to help us think through some of our questions to ensure we were setting that context. So I think a combination of Canada, but also that there are some really remarkable leaders in the design space like Dory Tunstall that have really provided frameworks for other academic leaders to think through how they can transform their institutions.
I guess two points there. I get, first of all, behind you, I noticed you have the "You're on Native Land" sign, and of course, last time I met with you in New York, I recall you were actually wearing a I think it was a cap with the same brand and logo on it, which is very, very cool. Is this who's designed that?
Yeah, so it's a LA-based brand, Indigenous run, and part of their brand, I mean, they have a variety of different fashion products, but You Are Native Land is their main, is like how they started. And I think it's a way really to provoke conversation, dialogue, discussion, which is so important. And that's obviously one of the roles fashion can have.
It's I think it's you know what, the reason I mentioned that, obviously because it's behind you and you're alluding to it as well, but for me, living in Arizona, I mean, I live just around the corner from, I'm on native land, of course, but like the native population here is very visible. So when I was in New York visiting you, to see the hat, it did make me think, oh yeah, of course, I'm in New York, but this is, and it made me want to go away and think more about place and the history and legacy of that. So that was really, really interesting. So I think it's really important just to kind of highlight that, yeah, you may be living in Toronto or New York or Los Angeles, but just because you're not in Texas or Wyoming or Arizona, you're still on native land, and to drawing people's attention to that, especially if they're 18 and they're working on design within New York and they're from the Bronx or something. So it's like a very interesting point to highlight. But something else that makes me think of as well, though, thinking about more regional areas, is you're obviously you've alluded to Parsons has been labeled a progressive institution and has been at the forefront of making lots of interesting and exciting change for a long time. And you're in New York, an island of it in its own right. But in terms of for other scholars who maybe work at a fashion institution that's perhaps in a different state, that doesn't have access to all that culture, or that has maybe slightly more regressive politics, and they face different challenges, do you have any advice or guidance, or how we can roll this kind of agenda out domestically across the United States, or how what people could do from these institutions to feel that they're supported in their sort of chasing these endeavors themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously really always important to ground yourself in place. So what is the history of the specific land you're on, the Indigenous groups who inhabited it, continue to inhabit it, what is the different fashion cultures that have existed? So I think there's something about really being place-based wherever you're located, but thinking of that as like value and knowledge that we can connect to our curriculum and research and our thinking about fashion. And I think, and I know we're going to talk more about this, but that for faculty members who are in institutions that maybe are less progressive, or there's more resistance to this type of change, particularly at an institutional level, that the classroom can really be this radical space of possibility. And I think that, maybe we can't change the entire institution overnight, and institutions will change at different paces and different rhythms, but what we can do in our classroom, right, is powerful. What we can do in our scholarship is powerful, particularly as faculty members who, are full-time and eventually, right, sort of move through a process in the US and Canada of tenure, that carries a great deal of privilege if you're awarded that in what you're able to do. While I'm always mindful that for faculty members who are precarious or who are on tenure track, it can often be more challenging to resist kind of dominant policies. And so, I recognize that sometimes there's a game to play to get to that point, particularly at some institutions. But I think for faculty members that certainly have that security, it's important to speak up and make the change, and also particularly to support adjunct faculty, part-time faculty, tenure track faculty in work they want to do that's radical, and really using that seniority or privilege and security they have to champion others without that in the institution.
I think that's a very well made point there to a bit of a vague question. But let me ask you a straighter question. Really, you talk about the progressive classroom, and that leads me to think about your recent book, Fashion Education: The Systemic Revolution, edited by yourself and Deborah Christel, of course published by Intellect in the summer of 2023. A book that we're very proud of, and that is having real world impact and affecting some real change. So could you just tell us a little bit about what is the book in a nutshell? I mean, it's a series of 17 essays by an international cohort of fashion educators. But what were the goals? And just tell us, a little bit about the book in sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think the last question you asked me really inspires why we wrote this book. I connected with Deb based on our interest in radical and progressive pedagogy. She had done a lot of work around fat fashion pedagogy. I was doing work around disability, and we connected sort of thinking about what does access mean in fashion? How do we translate this in the classroom? And as we write about in the introduction, we had very different experiences. I was in an institution that was quite progressive, that supported this kind of radical pedagogy and change, and supported me throughout the process as I went up for tenure and moved through the stage. Deb, and she writes about this in the introduction, was in a much more conservative institution. And as she was developing fat fashion courses, bringing in fat studies to how we think about design and fashion, there was a great deal of resistance, hostility, and she didn't receive the support. Senior colleagues didn't think this was fashion, and that put her in a very difficult position of, do I compromise my values? Do I change what I want to do? And eventually, because of that, she realized she could no longer stay at that institution and continue teaching part-time, but move to actually start and be very successful as a designer of a size inclusive brand, and using her academic research and PhD research to really guide the concepts behind that. And so part of the book was like, okay, there are many of us kind of radical fashion educators around the world who are developing courses that challenge the harm that fashion causes. And particularly, we were thinking about harm around the body by fostering this either very narrow body ideal, these really dominant standards of identity and who's included and who's not, or just a very narrow approach to thinking about the body. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a space in this book to bring fashion educators together to share what they're doing in the classroom, and really highlight the different experiences of fashion educators who were supported, and what that support allowed them to do, but also those that faced very clear resistance to their ideas in their classroom and their strategies to navigate that. So in the fact, the book is almost a collection of 17 essays that are almost like autoethnography. Educators are sharing their own lived experience, both as people and also as educators. They focus on one or more classes they've taught that center equitable and inclusive approaches to the body in a very broad way. And they also shared the challenges they faced or the support they've received and how they've navigated it. And each chapter ends with not just a call to action for other educators, but advice on for folks who want to do this and might be in a similar situation and context. And I think for this was realizing that institutional change often results on who happens to be the leaders in that institution, the vision, the values, that we don't often have full control over as faculty members, but the work we do in the classroom can be radical, and it can bubble up to change in curriculum, to change in our universities and colleges, and to change in the industry. So kind of grounding a lot of our thinking in emergent strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, and realizing that those small scale changes can have a huge transformation. And so this was really about that, these small scale changes happening in the classroom and wanting to share the stories and the advice and recommendations of educators so others wouldn't feel alone and they would know that there was this larger movement across fashion education of educators who are advancing inclusion and diversity in their classrooms and hopefully inspiring others of what they can do in their curriculum and their courses, but also providing a sense of connection that even if you're the only one in your institution doing this, you're not isolated. There's a much larger group of us, of these radical fashion educators.
Excellent, excellent. And it sounds like you firmly believe in the power of the classroom and the teaching and the small scale, and then from there, that building incremental change at a systemic level, which I think is really cool and something that more people need to get back to, because a lot of the time I think that educators can be radical in their theoretical approach, but then they share that only with people on their level who already have access, on a very cerebral level, rather than trying to break things down with the inclusion of the next generation and finding practical solutions. So it sounds like you're a person who very much feels that teaching is vitally important still.
I do. I mean, I'm an educator first and foremost at heart, right? The classroom is my favorite place to be. And so I think that, it is a place of radical possibility. And we ground, obviously, in bell hooks as well, thinking of the classroom as a site of liberation and education as a site of liberation. And these are really the groundings for the book. I think I've seen the value and the importance of institutional change, certainly what Dory Tunstall's done, why I'm in this role as dean, not because I don't want to be in the classroom, I certainly do, but because I know that institutional change always matters, but not every school has a chair or a dean that's committed to that work, or a university provost or president. And so I wanted to recognize, and I think in my conversations with Deb, recognizing our very different experiences was like, no, this book is important because really the culture and the leadership of the institution varies, but that classroom is a space that we can really create that type of change. And I think for me as an educator has always been, there's not a separation between my scholarship or research here and my teaching practice here. It's so deeply connected that the ideas we're talking about in the classroom inform my thinking and research. The research I do informs what I teach and how I teach. And so they're very much interconnected for me.
And Ben, can you just tell us a couple of the sort of themes and topics that kind of come up, in the table of contents of the book? Because it seems to cover a wide range and a diverse range of topics. So maybe you could just reel off a couple of examples that people could expect if they were to, to purchase or encounter the book at their library.
Yeah, I'll say that we went back and forth between, do we, divide the book into 3 parts? Do we not? Do we keep the, essays? Like, how do we structure this? And we'd originally created, 3 different sections of the book, and then decided that actually one theme could never really encompass one chapter, that the chapters take a very intersectional approach to thinking about the body, but they're also filled with so many different intersecting strategies and approaches. So the book is like 17 chapters that readers and listeners can go through however they want. They can pick, they can make their own connections. And I think we also wanted not to order or categorize because we wanted to get away from that kind of power of the editor. The themes of the book are very far-reaching. We have Deb who's written a chapter on her fat fashion pedagogy and what fat studies and fat liberation does when we bring that to a design curriculum and how it transforms the design process. Riley Kuchrin, they wrote about bringing an Indigenous perspective and epistemology to a series of courses and how they've changed courses, experienced courses by bringing that way of thinking and practice. We have a wonderful chapter on designing for drag in Australia, where students actually designed clothing for drag queens, learning about the body, learning about gender, learning about identity, and the excitement and challenges of doing that. We have chapters on designing with disabled folks and like what happens when we bring community into the classroom, the power and also the challenges of doing that. How do we welcome in community and also give them full credit and compensation? It's chapters, 2 chapters that address that, including one I wrote about creating an accessible fashion show. So chapters on the experiences, really great one on working with a mannequin by one of my continuing collaborators, Tanvir Ahmed, who wrote a really great chapter on the role of the mannequin in not just thinking about a particular body type in design, but like a non-moving, breathing, feeling body, a body that was white, and how do we, challenge that in the classroom in the design. And she's talked about how she's challenged the mannequin. So really our chapters are covering everything from disability to body size, to race, to indigeneity, to queer and like trans fashion topics. So it's really encompassing of thinking about the body and identity in an intersectional way and how faculty are intervening in traditional practices and knowledge sets of fashion to dramatically expand that. So students are thinking about fashion design, fashion theory, fashion communications, fashion management in ways that are really body inclusive and body just.
Thank you, Ben. I think they really captured that in a nutshell there. Thank you for those contributions. And if anyone's interested in finding out more about fashion education, of course, intellectbooks.com, you can read all kinds of bits and pieces about the book there. So I would advise you to go and do that. But of course, fashion education is not the only book that you have published with Intellect. So I did want to just ask you about a couple of other things as well. So you edited Crossing Gender Boundaries, Fashion to Create, Disrupt and Transcend with one of our other editors, Andy Riley. And of course, you've published in several Intellect journals, including Fashion, Style and Popular Culture, the International Journal of Fashion Studies, and Critical Studies in Men's Fashion, among others, I believe. So I was just wondering, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year as a publishing company. And I was just thinking maybe you could tell the audience something that you particularly either love or respect about working with Intellect, or something that you've really enjoyed over the years.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say on this. I think 3 things I really value about Intellect as a publisher is, first and foremost, there's a very human approach. I think when you're publishing a book, when you're working with a journal editor, from the idea and submission to the final, product, the final publication, you're not just dealing with an online system and automated responses, and it's impossible to get a human. There's such a deep human commitment, both from the editorial staff and marketing staff at Intellect, but also from the editors who are selected to lead the journals. And I think it humanizes a process that can be really stressful, that can produce a lot of anxiety, and that often can feel quite automated today. And I think that human approach values authors and values relationships and values people. And I think that is rare in publishing, and that's very special. I think that I appreciate that Intellect takes such a expansive approach to fashion studies, recognizing that it intersects with so many different fields, and those intersections are so expansive. And I think the range, the list of journals in fashion, the range of books coming out really speak to a deep commitment towards what the field is and what it could be, and recognizing the depth and richness of it. I think the third thing that I truly love about Intellect is I think that there's a deep excitement for new forms of scholarship and creative approaches to scholarship. That it's really a publisher that values ways of thinking that challenge the dominant narrative and even dominant forms of how research is presented. It really encourages us to, there's a platform that really encourages us to just expand what fashion is, how we study it, and how we share that knowledge. And I think that that's rare because there's often such gatekeeping or strict standards to, follow dominant academic systems. And I think Intellect values the importance of, the peer review process and is open to authors challenging dominant ways the field has been set up.
Oh, well, thank you. I don't think we could ask for a better testimonial from our point of view, because I think we're certainly not risk averse. We do like to challenge the dominant hierarchies and hegemony. We do like to take a different approach, that's for sure. But I think the author-centered, human-focused kind of cottage industry approach, even though that we're a major international publishing company, I think is really valuable to us. And I'm very glad that you highlighted that, because it's something that we really want to retain, especially as we grow. And, we're starting to publish handbooks in fashion studies now. But, and of course, I know you're involved along those lines as well. And I think, you move into an area like handbooks, it becomes even more important that you retain that author-centered human approach, and don't just fall into joining the dots and creating almost textbooks or handbooks that don't take into account all of these important parts of our identity and ideology. So yeah, I guess watch this space. Handbooks are coming soon. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ben.
Yeah, I'll add. I'm working with Andy Riley and Jose Blanco on a handbook of men's fashion that it's going to be submitted next month, and it's been a really human approach in supporting us in the long process of putting that together. Openness to the ways. This book I think is hoping to advance the study of men's fashion by really taking an intersectional approach, an approach that is both decolonizing and decentering Western perspectives, and one that really understands a global perspective on men's fashion, again, to show this just plurality. And it's been a really fun project to work on. And a lot of it is just the support and openness we've gotten from Intellect as we've been really thinking through what this could look like and how to make the best contribution to the field.
Oh. Well, thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate your eloquent answers on such, quite complicated and ever-evolving topics. But before I let you go, I do have some quick time questions for you. So, a few little fun questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a few. You can just give me a straight answer, or you can add a little context if you think it needs it. So it's up to you. But here we go. So let's start with a bit of a classic. What 5 people, dead or alive, would you invite to your dream dinner party?
I would say I would invite my family, which is maybe not as an exciting answer, but I think that is in a role where you're on and you're meeting with people. I think the time where I'm the most just myself, I can just decompress, is when I'm with my family, because they live in different spaces, and now I live in New York. I don't get to see them as often as I did. And so I think that I would pick my family to invite for dinner.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, being an expat from the UK who now lives in the US, away from my family as well. So I can appreciate that answer. I think it's unexpected, but I like it. I like the way you've taken that one. So up next, you obviously, you're building your notoriety. So when Hollywood comes a calling, who would play you in the Ben Barry biopic?
I feel like I would pick Macaulay Culkin from Home Alone.
Nice.
And like maybe there's some aging, but I'd like to go back to like maybe Home Alone 2. And that like I feel like that epitomizes my energy.
I like that. That's another great answer. So it would be 90s Macaulay Culkin, not the current Macaulay Culkin playing you. Okay, I like that. In
Yes.
spirit at least. Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Well, we are a book publishing company, so I wanted to ask you, what are you currently reading? No trick questions. Doesn't have to be an intellect book, but yeah, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, what are you reading?
I'm reading a book, The Biopolitics of Disability, as I'm working on my like now publishing from a 4-year project I did on masculinity, disability, and fashion, and really trying to deeply like think through the project through a disability studies lens. And the book I mean, I've just started, but it's fascinating, and it's thinking about how disabled folks are often assimilated into like non-disabled society rather than a recognition of the wisdom and creativity and vitality that disability has in and of itself. And so it's sort of challenging this assimilation into a consumer culture or into dominant society. And it's very much aligned with some of my thinking from the research I've done. And so, yeah, one of my favorite things about fashion studies is you're able to think through all these different fields and bring it to bear on fashion. And so it's been, a great read and like one of my favorite things in the field.
Oh, cool. What was the title of that book for anyone who's interested in checking it out?
It is called The Biopolitics of Disability.
Biopolitics of Disability. Cool. Thank you very much. Well, another question, sort of book related. Are there any books that you're rather embarrassed that you haven't read? I guess mine's Moby Dick. So what's your Moby Dick?
I think I'm more embarrassed by the massive pile of books I have beside my bed, where I've started all of them, but then I get excited about the next book and read that. So I have a pile of unfinished books where maybe 1 or 2 chapters have been read. And so that is maybe what I'm embarrassed about, is I can be like, yes, I've read this. But then if we get too deep into the conversation, I'm like, oh, I still need to get to those 7 other chapters.
Well, I mean, yeah, as a publisher, I mean, that's an occupational hazard for me and my colleagues. We read so much, but yeah, you're not always able to read every book cover to cover. So that is definitely a challenge that we face too. The ever mounting pile, self-created problem as well, of course, on my part. Well, you're renowned for being a stylish academic. So I was just wondering, are there any fashion designers that you most admire?
I'm a big fan of like secondhand shopping and vintage shopping. And I think there's so many spots in New York with an amazing like secondhand scene. So I think that is not just, that's certainly my choice, but also a hobby, is I love going on the hunt.
The thrift. You've got to come down here to Tucson, because having lived in New York for some time as well, I know that the hunt there is a great challenge, because there's so many type places where you got to go and sign away your life before they'll let you in, or whatever else it might be, and it seems like it's more challenging than buying from a regular store. But down here in Tucson, you have so many thrift stores, and there's so many amazing finds that can be had, whether it be furniture or fashion. So I'd highly recommend a visit to Tucson for anyone who's in the thrift game. That's for sure. Now, I know you in your role as dean there, you work closely with the School of Design, and of course Parsons is very famous for its work in the fields of design as well, not only within fashion context, but just generally speaking. So I was just wondering, are there any favorite designs that you have or you have encountered? I know some people are like, Stark's lemon juicer or something like that. Is there anything that you find to be particularly formally or functionally well designed?
Yeah. So the School of Fashion, which I'm dean of, is one of 5 schools at Parsons, each one focusing on a broad kind of area of design. And I think I would say, and this might be, I think one of the things I've learned about since coming here is the Parsons table, which is the table I'm actually sitting at right now, which is just like a rectangular table, just with like I am not a furniture designer, so my language will not be good, but just with the top and 4 simple legs. And I know the goal of it was that it was supposed to be a democratic and accessible table that was, low cost to build, that anyone could use, that had a variety of functions. And I think that kind of philosophy that went behind the table in terms of thinking about something that, was economically possible for so many folks, that was accessible, that could be easily made. Those values, I think when those values inform design, that is like truly right, like that makes for good design, when access is centered into what we do. So I think the Parsons table I've learned about since being here. We have them all over campus, of course, and I think they're really well designed and something I appreciate, but particularly the vision and the philosophy behind it.
I think I know what you mean by the Parsons table, but I guess people can Google that if they want to take a look for themselves. Okay, that's cool. And in that answer, you mentioned philosophy, and I guess that leads me to my next question, which is there a particular scholar or perhaps a school of thought, ideology, philosophy, any of these things that's particularly kind of impacted your own work or thinking?
I think too. I mean, I think generally intersectionality and Black feminist thought completely transformed how I think about the world. When I was in my undergrad, I needed to sign up for a course. I was one course short. The only course I could get into was a women and gender studies course. I knew nothing about this, but that course ended up like shaping my entire framework of how I think about the world and life, but also in my academic career, by exposing me to Black feminist thought. And I think that really helped me think about privilege, marginalization, context, and social change in really important and powerful ways. So I think that fully shaped me. I think just that whole space of Black feminist thought and scholarship. I think the other, I mean, I've said this on this podcast already to you, but I think obviously Dory Tunstall and her work in decolonizing design, but even before that, just the work that was so clear that she's done and shared of how she was shifting a culture of an institution. I think that's been really inspiring for me as an academic leader. Often we think academic leadership, you're just dealing with HR or looking at budgets or from meeting to meeting. And it's just like a dull, dreary kind of job. But I think she showed that like, if you're lucky enough to be in like a seat of leadership and you're in there for a limited period of time, you can decide how you want to use that role. And I think for me, it's like, I want to come to it with such intention and purpose to try to make change. And she really created a roadmap of how you can do that, what that can look like. And I think created a path that I can follow and build on. And so I'm forever indebted to her, because it's made academic leadership not just about management or administration, but truly like practice-based research and deeply theoretically informed. Like I see, just as I said, teaching and research are together. I think my leadership is deeply connected to my teaching and research. All of the theories and the findings and what I've written and taught, that inform how I approach day-to-day decision-making and how I show up as an academic leader.
Well, I guess while we're mentioning Dory, and her name has come up a couple of times, so I guess we should say that if you go on the Intellect website, you can find some contributions Dory has made to our journals. But of course, Dory was able to publish her book, Decolonizing Design, I believe last year with MIT, which is an incredible and important work. So I do recommend that people go and check that out as well. And of course, Dory was a guest on this podcast, I think more than once, twice, in fact. So you can go back and you can check out our YouTube channel and you can hear what Dory has to say about similar topics to what I've been discussing with Ben today as well. And also you might get an indication of how things have changed and progressed over the last few years. Also, another point you just raised there, which is funny, because I've been talking to a few people recently about moments that have changed their lives. And quite a few Americans have said to me, it's been in these instances where they had like half a credit or 2 credits or whatever credits they needed, and they ended up doing some segue into PE or some segue into Black feminism or whatever it might be that they didn't anticipate, which has then actually changed their lives and ended up being the path that they've followed. So it's interesting that moment for you and the way that the American system works in kind of higher education, that you can take this, momentary look at something, but that could revolutionize your approach to your life and career. So that's kind of interesting. You're not the first person who said that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very grateful I took that course my first semester of my first year in undergrad. Thank you to Professor Mary Nyquist, who was the faculty member who taught the course. And then I ended up transferring to Women and Gender Studies and doing that as my undergraduate degree. And obviously that has informed so much of my work. So yeah, I mean, that also, I think, when I talked about the power of the classroom, I think for me, it's very real because that one moment completely expanded my world and showed the power of the classroom to really shift how you think and practice.
Well, I'm going to take it a little bit lighter here. So it's a Friday night. Are you going to the drag show or to the opera?
Definitely the drag show.
Any, I know there's still a great legacy and great performances taking place in New York all the time. Any particular performers or any particular establishments you'd shout out? If anyone's in town looking for a night on the tiles, as they say.
I think I would just say that what's great about New York is that there's drag shows happen throughout the city, that there's such a vibrant drag culture and performance culture, and that it's definitely a place where, I mean, you'd see great shows and you see the difference of each neighborhood and borough and what they bring. And I think that really makes New York special.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to live around the corner from Enid's before it closed, so I was able to check out a few of the classic performances myself. And yeah, real shame that one went, but I know that there's plenty that are still going and new ones that are always jumping up. So definitely a highlight of any trip to New York is a drag show. Cheaper than the opera normally as well, so that's something else to be said.
Depending on how much
right?
we're tipping that night.
And again, just another fun one here. Every writer's got to eat, and if you're faced by a blood sugar meltdown, you've got writer's block. What's your go-to snack?
So I have celiac, so I'm gluten-free. So I would say anytime I can get a good gluten-free muffin, that will be always that.
That'll get you back on the writer's track. Okay. And then finally, from me, what's next for you? What are you currently working on?
What's next? So I think so I recently finished this 4-year study, collaborative study on disability, fashion, and masculinity called Cribbing Masculinity, where we did wardrobe interviews with disabled men and masculine identified folks. We did this project where they hacked up one of their garments to create something that would actually fit their bodies and express their identities. We did an exhibition with them to showcase their stories and their clothing at an art gallery that focuses on disabled artists in Toronto called Tangled Arts and Disability. And then we also did a fashion show where they presented their clothes through this really embodied, multisensory, effective performance. And so right now I'm slowly going through all of this research and thinking of the story I want to tell. And I'm hoping to eventually turn this into a book on fashion and gender and disability. And so that's kind of my main focus. And slowly I've been just publishing with my colleagues from the project. I know we will have an article in the special issue of the International Journal of Fashion Studies that's focused on methods and methodology, where we talk about our multisensory approach and multisensory methodology within the project. So that, I think, is coming out in maybe April, I think, is the launch of that issue. So yeah, that project has been my main focus. And then I think I'm always continuing to think on this other path of work on fashion education, and particularly thinking about how my own practice and what I experience and how I can reflect on that theoretically and how I can contribute to thinking about how others can also make change in fashion education. What are the possibilities and what are the limitations? So that's writing kind of from fashion education that I'm kind of continuing to think about and do.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time today and for these insightful thoughts, comments, and your lighthearted ones as well. So we all know what we want to do on a Friday night. That's always great to know when we're talking to our authors and editors. But it's such a pleasure to work with you. And, looking through the list of books and journals that you've worked with, I'm so proud that a number of Intellect's titles are among them. So thank you for working with us, and congratulations on all the work that's out there in the world, and best of luck with all the future endeavors and your work as a dean. And I would just urge anyone out there to go and check out what Ben's doing, both with Parsons, with Intellect, and with all the other publishers and various other organizations and associations that Ben's a part of. So yeah, just Google Ben Barry and all that stuff will come up, or visit intellectbooks.com for more information. Ben, thank you again. Any final thoughts from you?
No, thank you for your terrific questions. This has been really fun. And yeah, thank you for what you're doing for scholars, students, practitioners, fashion enthusiasts in this field. I think, you're having a huge impact, and you really provide a platform, as I said, for us to be able to share the work we do, and in ways that are on our own terms. So thank you, and thank you to Intellect for that.